Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching by Rabbi Adam Kligfeld.
In general, pretty much every rabbi that I know has two basic methods for how they prepare a text study. One is they know what they want to talk about, and they search until they find the sources that allow them to bring that out in an artful way. No. Believe it or not.
You don't say.
And the other way is kind of the very thing that brought us, most of us, to rabbinical school in the first place, which is this thing called study the Torah. Just open it up and see what it's delivering this week. Where is it taking you? I had no specific intent for this Shabbat when I was preparing Parshat Hukat. You know, there's nothing going on in the world, so there's nothing for me to attach it to. So I'm going to study Parshat Hukat and see what speaks to me. And I could not have imagined the directions that my own inquiry took me into. And what you're seeing is a concentration of the sources that I got exposed to, many of them not only individual texts, but general sources from the tradition and the halachic tradition, the legal tradition, and the Hasidic tradition that either I haven't looked at in a long time or I've never seen before. The tradition is vast. And I want to share with you something that stems from a very short but emotionally packed scene in Parshat Hukat, which is actually beyond what Mark and Rick read today. And I'm going to read out everything I have because some people are following by Zoom, and I want to make sure that everything is said out loud. This is intended to be a conversation if you want it to be. I have plenty to say. But if you have something to say, please contribute, and I'll repeat it back to the microphone so people who are joining digitally can participate. So, the first source on your sheet from chapter 20, verse 1 through 2. Vayavo b'nei Yisrael kol ha'edam midbar Tzin. All of the children of Israel came as a single congregation to the wilderness of Tzin, b'chodesh harishon. People are not sure if that means either on the first month or on the first new moon, because chodesh can mean both month and moon in the Torah. So if we wanted to actually date when it was, and this is of the 40th year. This is at the end of their wandering. So this is either the first new moon or sometime in the first month of the 40th year of their wanderings. Vayeshev ha'am b'kadesh, and the people dwelled at Kadesh, and the next section doesn't even get its own verse. It's the second half of a verse. By the way, V'tamot sham Miriam v'tigeber sham. Miriam died there, and she was buried. She doesn't even get a whole verse to describe her death. This person who saved Moshe from the water, and as you'll see from Midrashic interpretation, is the source of nourishment for the people throughout the wandering. The next verse, which people attach to Miriam's death, gets more attention than her death itself. V'lo haya mayim la'edah. There was no water for the congregation. What inference would you or anyone make out of the juxtaposition that Miriam dies and instantly there's no water for the congregation? The inference is what? She's the source of the water. Or that there's got to be some kind of causal or coincidental connection between her no longer being alive in the world and the people really experiencing profound thirst. Why else would the Torah, which is scripted so intentionally, juxtapose those two ideas? Vayikahalu al Moshe v'Aaron. And the very thirsty congregation rose up, turned into a kahal, but here the word kahal doesn't mean they became a nice shul congregation. They became like an enraged congregation against Moses and Aaron, saying, we are thirsty. Not the only time where they express that rage. Rashi, famously on that verse, on the verse, V'lo haya mayim le'edah, mikan, from here we learn, shekol arba'im shana, all 40 years. It's actually 39 years, because this is the beginning of the 40th year. I don't know why he says 40 years. Haya lehem ha'ba'er, the well that according to the tradition traveled with them. There was a miraculous well. Every one of those stops that we're going to read about in a few weeks in Parshat Matot. They encamped, they put it at the Mishkan, they found a well. They decamped, they moved to the next place, they encamped, they put it at the Mishkan, they found a well. The only reason why that well followed them throughout the desert, according to this read of Rashi, is because B'schut Miriam. because of the merit of Miriam, and he gives us the source. It's from the Talmud, Tractate Tanit, page 9, verse side A. Right? This, by the way, is lyrical, and it's also symmetrical, because Miriam's significance to our people begins with saving Moshe from the water, and then her death ends up helping us realize that it was through her that the Israelites had water. Right? So she's a woman and a sister and a leader who gives the thing that you most need in the desert, water, right? And who saved the future leader of the Israelites from the thing that water can sometimes do to you, which is actually take your life. You must have water to live life, and as anyone who has lived through both drought and flood, right? The absence of water and the overabundance of water can be brutal. Miriam is a representation of the perfect harmony of both. Okay. That's the classic read through Rashi and the Talmud of Miriam. But once you start looking into Hasidic texts, you get some interesting stuff. Look at source 3, by Shmuel Donat. If I had come across this sage before in my 30 or so years studying the tradition regularly, I have no memory of it. I've never come across that name as far as I know. A commentary called the Chidushei Shmuel. He was from Pressburg, which is in currently Slovakia. Those of you who might be on the synagogue trip next year to Poland and to the Czech Republic and to Budapest, we're going to be driving right by Pressburg. We can say hello. I think he's buried there. Vatamot sham Miriam vatikaver sham. It says that she died there and she was buried there. He asked a very good question. Although I got to tell you, I've read this verse 1,000 times in my life. I've never thought to ask this question. Lama nichpala milat sham. Why is the word sham, which means there, repeated? She was buried there. She died there. She was buried there. Would not one there have been sufficient? Right? It's a good question. And then he repeats it. Vatamot sham. She died there. Vatikaver sham. She was buried there. Ita bechazal. We have this idea in Chazal. Chazal is an acting and meaning. Chochmenu zichronam levracha. Our sages of blessed memory. So it's like a short way of referring to the sages of the Talmud. But if you have to explain it, like I just did, it becomes a long way of referring to the sages of the Talmud. But Tractate Megillah, page 15a. Tzaddik avad. When a righteous person dies, lidoro avad. The righteous person is lost to the generation. Very classic, terse, Talmudic thinking. When a righteous person is lost, the person is lost to his generation or to her generation. What's implied in the Hebrew is the word only. That when someone of true merit is lost, is gone, who suffers? Those of us who are still alive, who wanted that person amongst us. But the idea is that only we suffer, because the Talmud is leaning into the metaphysical idea that someone's righteousness has material realness in the upper realms and for all generations, and that even though we might miss that righteous person, the righteous person and the righteousness is not gone from the world. And it keeps going. Mashal la'adam, this can be compared to a person, sha'avdalo margalit, you lost a pearl, you lost a jewel. Kol makom, switch the page, shehi margalit shema. You lost the pearl, but wherever the pearl is, it's still called a pearl. Right? So who's the one who suffered? Only you, because you don't have your gem anymore. But the gem isn't gone. The gem is sparkling somewhere. Unless it's been destroyed, the gem just is no longer available to you. In fact, the next person who finds it might find great beauty and joy from it. Similarly, when a righteous person is lost in the generation, we who wanted that righteous person amongst us, we are bereft. But true righteousness doesn't disappear. It just is no longer as accessible to the people who live in the mortal realm. Goes on, lo avda el leba'ala. The pearl is only lost to the original owner. Ulachein ba'a hahadgasha. That's why, according to Rabbi Shmuel Donat, the Torah emphasizes she died there, and she was buried there. Kirak shameta. It's just there that she died. That's where she took her last breath. It's just there that she's buried. Aval shma, her name, ugdulata, and her greatness, nish'aru ladorot, continued for the generations. It's the very thing all of us hope for in a short mortal life, that our death is not our end. that our influence persists. That we might even be someone like Shmuel Donath, who a couple hundred years from now will have written something and someone will unearth it and teach it to the next generation. Right? Whether you're a scholar or simply a human being, we are the only species that is burdened with the notion of the limitations of our life. We're aware of our mortality pretty early on in our development. It's crushing to confront on some level, and therefore one of the most common aspirations of a human being is to do something, create something, write something, make something happen, such that when we are gone, our influence is not gone. Right? And so, yeah, she did die there. She was buried there. But Miriam's influence is still amongst us. We're still talking about her today. It's a really lovely read of just a doubling of the word there. And it represents about half of the Jewish tradition's understanding of death, which is that it's not an end. It's a beginning of a new way that your soul and what you accomplish in life has a chance to live on after you. That's about half of what our tradition says about death. But let's go deeper, because we're going to see hints at the other half through a very strange ritual that I knew nothing about until I started doing this deep dive on these sources. This is source 4, Miginzano Ha'atik. It's a collection, it's an oddly named collection called From His Old Connection. That's what the book is called. It's a collection of Torah insights and witticisms, mostly from the Chabad Lubavitch tradition, but not exclusively. On the same verse, Vatamot Sham Miriam died there, V'lo haya mayim leheda, and they had no water. Mikan haremez, from here we have a hint, la minhag, to a custom, which I had never heard of before coming across this, which is in Yorei Dea. This is the second section of the Shulchan Aruch written by Rabbi Yosef Karo in the 16th century. So in Yorei Dea, chapter 3, 39:5, Lishpoch et hamayim mehakelim, to pour out any water in the vessels, b'shebishchunat hamet, in the neighborhood of someone who has died. Apparently, it was a pretty common custom in both Sephardi and Ashkenazi communities, because the Ashkenazi gloss on this text, Rabbi Yosef Karo was a Sephardi rabbi living in Tzfat for the most part. He also lived in Greece and Thessaloniki. And then a couple of years later, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, who was an Ashkenazi rabbi based in Krakow, whose grave we're going to visit next year, for those of you on that trip. It was not supposed to be an advertisement for next year's trip. It was a common custom. Someone dies, the first thing you do, and I've never seen this done or heard of it, is to take any water that was already pumped and poured into some vessel and pour the water out. According to this collection, this is hinted at in Miriam died, and there was no water. And why was there no water? Because they had gotten rid of it. Why had they gotten rid of it? Because it was a custom. This is an anachronistic throwback. It's clear that's not what's happening in the story. But he's saying that thing that we Jews do now, we can connect it to that moment where a heroine dies and all of a sudden there's a lack of water. And he continues. Hashach. This is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch called the Siftei Kohen, which is shortened to Hashach, by Rabbi Shabtai Cohen, who lived in Lithuania in the 16th century. Hashach masbir tamirhag. He describes this custom ba'ofen pashut v'hagyuni, in a simple and logical way. Shehu meshamesh me'ein ot v'hoda'ah. Why do you pour out water when someone died? If you would ask me why one would do that before reading this, I guess I could, just using raw imagination, I can come up with it. But there's something obvious to me about why water gets poured out when someone dies. According to him, it's to serve as an oath, a sign, v'hoda'ah, an announcement, lamasha kara. It's basically the way of announcing a death, right? And if this is customary, you can imagine how striking it would be. If you did live in a community where when someone dies, and remember back then, people died in their homes. They weren't dying at cedars, right? And they weren't dying in car accidents or plane crashes. They got old or they got sick and they died where they were. And people lived in the same area. You can imagine what it would be like to walk through the pathways of your village, and all of a sudden you see someone coming out of their house and pouring out water. You know exactly what's happening. It would be very, very striking. They precluding them from having to announce by mouth, levaser habsora hara'ah, in order to announce the bad news. To which I say, why? What's the advantage in a communal setting or in a religious setting or a spiritual setting to have a ritual announce a death rather than have to say, bad news everyone, Shlomo Goldberg has passed away? Why? What's the advantage of that? What does that possibly accomplish? Stuart?
I mean, we have that same idea now where we take the onus off of a mourner to engage in any kind of social niceties. We put the responsibility on the kahal to act in a particular way to mourners, and essentially we provide the script for everything that is being said, and that's sort of the same thing going on here.
Great, I'll just repeat that. Stuart said that it actually reminds him of the fact that we try to spare mourners in the immediate aftermath of their loss of having to do just about anything because they're so focused on their grief. So this is a way of saying, if it might even be just hard for you to get the words out of your mouth, my mother died, my father died, my husband died, my child died, and that happened a lot back then, just pour water and everyone will know. Fascinating. Mark? Mark is the same thing. Anyone else? Just use your imagination. Why would that custom develop? And with that rationale. Yeah, let's have them pour out water, and that way they don't even have to announce it. What does that earn us? Any thoughts? There's an answer that's given later on in a different text, but I wonder if anyone else had their own thought. Someone's pointing at someone. Laura.
No, my mind went to sort of gossip and people starting to talk and, the weight of words, like that.
Very good. So Baruch Shekivant, you had the kavanah that we're going to come up to later. The idea is that it might be impossible, particularly amongst Jews, to mention someone's name and to mention that they died without the inevitable chatter, what an SOB that guy was. Or she deserved it. Or God finally took her, right? It's a way of just removing words from a moment that is beyond words. Right? It's actually very powerful, right? And for those of you who've been at funerals where I officiate, when we do the filling in the grave, I invite everyone to come fill in the grave, which is a very important mitzvah. I invite everyone, and usually this lasts about 30 to 90 seconds, to do it wordlessly, to not have it be chatter around the grave. Like, let's focus on what's happening. Let's not have this be a moment of words and speaking. Let's have it be a moment of ritual. It's very hard to do. People are usually chatting about 60 or 90 seconds later, but for the first 60 seconds, it's quiet, except for the sound of the shovel in the earth. And when you have no words but just visual ritual, you're processing it on a very different level. And sometimes we talk to distract ourselves from the enormity of what's going on. Maybe there's something like that built in as well. Let's look at the Shulchan Aruch. I had never, as far as I know, read this line in the Shulchan Aruch. This is source number 5, Yorei Dea. That's the second section of Shulchan Aruch, chapter 339:5. Minhag, it's a minhag, lishpoch kol hamayim she'uvim shebeshchunat tameit, to throw out all, or to pour out all of the already collected and pumped water in the neighborhood of the person who died. So it's one line that apparently represents a pretty common custom. And now I'm going to bring you several different commentaries on that. So the Shulchan Aruch is still being commented on. And here's one of several commentaries. Source 6 on page 3. Called the Be'er Hatev, which means the good explanation. It's one of the classic commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, written by Rabbi Yehuda ben Shimon Ashkenazi, who lived in Germany and Poland in the 18th century. One of the rare sages whose last name was Ashkenazi, who was actually Ashkenazi. Most Ashkenazi last names represent a Sephardi family, which is interesting. That's for another sermon. But this is Rabbi Yehuda ben Shimon Ashkenazi, who was Ashkenazi, Germany and Poland. He says on the word lishpoch. Why? I got to tell you, the next line, I don't think I fully understand. If you understand it, help me out. Mipnei shemalach hamavet, the angel of death, who for some people in the Jewish community then and now is a real being, right? It's an actual force in the world. That when someone takes their last breath, it's not pure physiology and biology and a lack of oxygen to the brain. It's the angel of death, the same one that spared us on Exodus night, knocks on the door and is the one, through God, who takes life away. I'm not even sure of the syntax of this, and I don't know if I translated it right. Something like, the angel of death brings down with water a drop of the blood of death. I don't even know what he means, but something about connecting the fact that since blood is no longer going to be coursing through the body, and somehow the angel of death does that with a drop of water, and therefore the pouring out of the water is like evocative of the angel of death's bringing water. But move on to the next thing. Uba Tashbetz, and in the book called the Tashbetz, Rabbi Shimshon ben Simach Duran, who lived in Spain and northern Africa, 14th, 15th century, Katav, he wrote, Shera'a achat sheshata mahamayim. He once saw someone drink from the water that was already poured out in someone's home where someone had died before it got, that was poured into a vessel. He saw someone drink from it before it got poured out. Shayu b'bayit b'shat p'tirat hamed. They had been in the house in the moment of death. Ukshera'a chacham. And when the sage saw this person doing the opposite of what you're supposed to do, instead of pouring it out, he was consuming it. Ga'arbo, he rebuked him. Don't drink that water. And a short time after, sheshata hamayim, after he drank it, yatsa nishmato, he died as well. Shaloto sheshata, the person who drank the water, the tainted water, the malach hamavet water, the water that we want to get rid of from our houses because it's the water that was kind of sitting in the house if someone died, that person died, according to this story. Vishalu l'chacham, and they asked that sage, Mara ita shagab. What did you see? What did you witness that you rebuked him for drinking the water before he died? It wasn't helpful because he kept drinking. But what did you see? Amar, he said, Ani ra'iti et malach hamavet. I saw the angel of death. Sheshif et sakino. He was like cleaning his knife. B'mayim shayuba oto habayit, in the water that was already in the vessels of that house. Le'achar p'tirat hamed, after the person died. What you're beginning to see here in this ritual is a very real understanding from some of our ancestors that death comes at the hands of a force in the world, the angel of death that brings it. And this should come as no surprise. It's an awful thing. Right? It's very different than the first notion of Miriam died, but she's still amongst us. Miriam died, but her influence is with us. Miriam died, and we should celebrate the eternality of her soul. This is the ritual of someone died, which means someone took their person's life, and that someone is the angel of death. And let's dissociate ourselves as much as possible from anything that might be tainted by the angel of death's presence, because the angel of death was washing his knife in the water, because we don't want another death. Right? The first way of looking at it, which is inspiring, is sort of a romanticized version of what we can think of in terms of what happens after death, and to help us come to terms with it when it's someone that we love or our own impending death. But the ritual represents a much more grounded, understandable terror. A terror that someone was alive and is no longer. That someone breathed and is no longer breathing. And we want to get as far away from that as possible because we cherish life. We're a this world tradition. Look at the Be'er HaGolah, Rabbi Moshe Rifki's 17th century Prague, which is one of the places we're going to be on the synagogue trip next year. Maybe we should, and I didn't even mention Poland. Lithuania, we're not going to be in Lithuania. But some people, when we went to the Balkans, thought we were going to be in Lithuania because the Balkans and the Baltics sound very similar. That actually happened. I announced on the bus to the trip to the south that the next trip we were doing was going to go to the Balkans. And someone came up to me at the front of the bus and said, so excited, I'm so excited we're doing that. I've always wanted to go to Estonia. Actually, Estonia is Baltics, not Baltics. Okay. He wrote a commentary called the Be'er HaGolah, also on this ritual. Why? Kedei sheyadu shemet, so they should know that the person died. V'lo yodiu b'peh v'yeh motzi diba. This is what Laura was saying. That why do they pour it out? So there's a ritual that prevents them from having to say it out loud, so that no one, by saying that someone had died, will invite diba, calumny, right? Lashon hara on that person. Uchatav harada, and the Rada, which stands for Rabbi David Abudraham, who wrote a collection of Jewish rituals a couple of hundred years before. Sheyesh remes lazeh, there's a hint of this ritual, min haTorah, the verse we've been on this entire time. V'tamot sham Miriam, that Miriam died there, v'tikaber sham, she was buried there, v'lo hayamayim leida, that there was no water for the congregation, and he says it explicitly. Why was there no water? Not because the well dried up. Kikulam shafchu memihen. Everyone in the congregation poured out their water, lest the angel of death that took Miriam take them. And guess what? Afterwards, there was no water. It's their own fault, right? Very different than, the well that represented Miriam is gone. It's no, everyone poured out their water bottles. And guess what? When you're in a desert, don't pour out your water bottle. Look at source 8. We'll end with this. This is the Ben Ish Chai, a beloved halachist from Baghdad in the 19th and 20th century, right? Back when there was an enormous and a prevalent Jewish community in Baghdad and in many other cities in what's now Iraq and Syria. And look what the Ben Ish Chai says. V'chein sarich lihizaher ma'od. You got to be very careful. B'mayim mishumet, in the water with respect to someone who's died. Lishpoch hamayim, to pour out the water. Shayu b'bayit shabo meitameh, in the house that the person had died. And look how technical he gets, because remember the word in the Shulchan Aruch was everyone in that neighborhood. So of course the question is, well, what determines a neighborhood? Is it like if someone dies in what's this neighborhood called? Pico Robertson. Everyone has to pour out that water, right? I was thinking of what's right here. Harthei, thank you. Right. So what's a neighborhood? Gam bayit sheni, the second house next to the house. Uvayit shlishi, and the third house. Mikol hastadim, for every direction. Shal habayit shebo hamei. Right. So if someone dies, according to him, this is what they did in Baghdad. The two houses in every direction from that house were considered close enough to the infected home that they had to pour out their water. And as the sage known as the Chida, Rabbi Chaim David Azulai, who wrote in Jerusalem, Italy, the 18th, 19th century, Kiminhag Ir HaKodesh, this is the custom of the holy city of Jerusalem. Anyone know what that acronym stands for after Ir HaKodesh? Tat, Tet, Vav, Bet, Aleph. You see it on a tefillin box. Tikonein v'tiboneh b'mheira v'yameinu amen. May it be reestablished and may it built speedily in our days. Amen. That's what those 5 letters mean, and that's what's written on, I think it's the Shel Rosh box of tefillin. Whenever you say Jerusalem, you often add that on. V'chein haminhag po irenu Baghdad. He says this is also what we do in Baghdad. Va'afilu lerchotz behem yadayim. It's so infected, this water, that to wash your hands with that water, of course don't drink it. O lechabes begadim, or to wash the clothes, it's asur, it's prohibited. Because we want to stay away from anything having to do with death, because we're unromantic about death. Death is the end. And we want this to be a house of life, and not for other people to suffer from whatever is going on at water. V'im shagu, and even if you make a mistake, ubi shlu, and you cooked with that water, o afu, or you baked, ba'otam amayim, az haftashil v'hapat asur, even the thing that you cooked with the water should not be eaten. Right? The reason I bring this to you is, first of all, it's so interesting to see the nitty-gritty pikayun development of Jewish law, and the extent to which, however this minhag came to be, they took it so seriously that even if the water had been transformed into a thing, a cake, a bread, even that had too much of a remnant of the water that had been in a vessel, in a house, 2 houses away, where someone had died. Throw it out. You don't want to be connected to it. Jen. Yeah. We never think that way. Correct. Right? What Jen said is, through these rituals and through the story and through these laws, water is a substance of life. Water is a substance associated with death. And again, if you have experienced either flood or drought, we know that. Even though mostly we think of it as Mayim Chayim, right? A mikvah is Mayim Chayim, living waters, right? But sometimes it's the waters in a house of the opposite of Chayim, of death, and we want to stay far away. Skip a little bit. Look at the second paragraph. Va'az dahamayim esarim, the extent to which this water is prohibited. Hainu dafka im hayu mayim levadam. That's only if the water was like sitting out on its own in the moment that the person died. Aval im b'sha'ashame. Look how specific. If in the moment the person died, hayasharui b'mayim ochlin. If there was already food soaking in that water, it wasn't just water by itself. Ein esarim. then you don't have to prohibit it. Something to do with the fact that the Malach HaMavet would only be cleaning his knife in clean water, not in water in which you were, marinating a pickle or something. I have no idea why that was the example that came out of my mouth. Dechol midi di itbe psida. Anything that had food in it, which means that throwing it out would cause a certain amount of loss. Ein hamalach hamavet oseh sham nezek. The angel of death is kind and sympathetic. He's going to ruin your water, because water, at least in these places, was considered more prevalent. But he won't be a jerk and put his malach hamavet, angel of deathness, into water in which you were already soaking or cooking food, because he knows, or she, I don't know if the angel of death is male or feminine, that would force you to have to throw that out. He doesn't want to cost you any money, right? So the ways in which the angel of death, is being animated here and personalized as being the agent that takes life, but doesn't want to overly burden the community, is fantastical. But it's also a wonderful expansion of this idea. And I think every generation is trying to deal with what actually happens when someone goes from being alive to being dead. Look at the last paragraph, and then we'll finish up. Od katav harav zal. He also, who's the he? It's the Chida above, Rabbi Chaim David Yosef Azulai, said this, De'im nit'arvu mayim ha'asurim. If water that was prohibited, it was prohibited because it was in a vessel, in a house in which someone died. Mishumet, from a dead person. But mayim ksherim, if that water got mixed in, what normally happens when things get mixed in, treif or kosher, milchik and fleshik? They get what? Nullified. Well, they get nullified at what mathematical ratio? 1/60th. In certain conditions, not in any condition, right? I would say you can't do it intentionally. You can't take a very, very, very small piece of cheese and put it on a very, very big hamburger and say it's less than 1/60th, and bite very, very judiciously and say, hey, 1 in 60. Right? The first time I learned that rule, I was like, ooh, maybe you could engineer that. No. And liquids for sure, right? So if you're cooking a pot of chicken soup, which shouldn't be fleshik, but it is, and a little bit of... Let's go to a second day yontif. Let's have chicken parmesan as long as it's vegan chicken, right? What?
You're doing great.
Thank you, Rabbi Shah.
Chicken has just been declared parv.
Chicken is parv. It is parv. When was the last time you milked a chicken? If a little bit of milk falls into a beef soup, look at a beef soup. A beef soup. If the amount of milk is less than 1/60th of the volume of the soup and it gets mixed in, you can eat the soup. Not here. It's so toxic, this death water, that if a water that was prohibited because it was in the house of someone who died gets mixed in with mayim ksherim, kosher water. Kosher here doesn't mean kosher as opposed to not kosher. It means kosher meaning drinkable because it wasn't infected. Lo bat le b'shishim. Not nullified in 60. V'nesru kol hamayim. And all of it is prohibited. Listen, mostly I wanted to share this with you because I just found this fascinating. And I've been doing this for 30 years, and when I find new rooms in our scholarly tradition that I was never even in this house before, I'm thrilled, because it means I have that much more to learn. And I think it's a wonderful opening up of 5 Hebrew words. She died there and she was buried there. And then the next notion of there was no water. And that leads into a conversation which simultaneously holds up the mystical, spiritual, metaphysical notion that Miriam is still with us and she's still inspiring us. And she's gone. She will never live again. And that's traumatic for anyone who cared about Miriam or anyone who died. And we want to distance ourselves as much as possible from anything associated with that loss and that grief because it's so overwhelming. And I think that's what we're still dealing with to this day in this era every time we confront the impending end of life of someone who we love. Right? We want to lean into the idea that maybe it's not the end on some level. Maybe our soul and our spirits will reunite on some level. And that person's influence persists. And it's horrific. And we grieve understandably. And our darkness and our heaviness comes for good reason. And both of those things can exist simultaneously in the tradition and in the heart and minds of any individual person. Mark, last comment.
This is very fascinating, and it's caused me to think about one thing in particular that we didn't talk about in the text context. Has any scholar commented fact that maybe, possibly, we do this as a remembrance of Moshe because Miriam's death, the lack of water, the crying out of the people led to his downfall because of the incident with Hukat.
Interesting. What Mark says is maybe the custom really does derive from the notion that Miriam died and that moment began the beginning of Moshe's downfall. Who knows? I don't know. And again, this is the first time I confronted this, so I don't know the tertiary levels of scholarship on it. It did remind me when I read about it of was it the white smoke or the black smoke when the Pope dies? Right? They don't.
Election for the Vatican.
Oh, what happens when the Pope dies?
They bang on his head with a hammer.
Yeah, but isn't there also a non-verbal announcement that's a way of knowing that the Pope died?
Election.
The black smoke, right?
That's the election.
No, the white smoke is the election. The black smoke, they died.
Black smoke, if they don't elect the Pope, they burn the ballot.
Oh.
And if they do elect the Pope, sorry.
Putting the flag half-mast.
I thought it was the black smoke. I'm going to go with that, even though it's incorrect. The black smoke that died because it was a way of saying we don't want to announce that. Yeah. Was it over when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor?
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.